amazing.
Oh,
hello.
So wonderful to see you.
It's so nice
Beautiful.
to see
Yes.
like faces.
So many people sitting on the balcony, having a beautiful painting in the background, like all of this. This is amazing. Yeah, more handshake. Yeah, waves. Hello.
Also,
yes,
Mom, if you want to have the cat make an appearance, I would not be opposed to that. Just saying. Anyways, but oh my God, I'm so happy right now. Wow. Yeah, it's been about 2.5 months that I've been stuck in my apartment. So hello everyone. I have been so looking forward to this ever since we announced it, because we typically do quite a few events. And one of my favorite parts of our work is just getting to connect with everyone. And so I've been missing that a lot. So I think this will be really, really fun. To kind of kick off this conversation, we thought it would be really fun to have a conversation between the CFFP team, which is myself, Kristina, and Nina. I don't know where they are on your screens. They're right next to me on mine. And we've actually never really done this before. We typically always bring in people for our events and stuff, but we've never really sat down, just the three of us, and talked about our work together. So I am a co-founder, Kristina is a co-founder as well, and Nina is a co-director. And we are the three musketeers, kind of making things happen with CFFP. So we'll be discussing, like I said, feminist responses to the pandemic, what we hope to see happen, how this has changed our work, how we've sort of shifted gears a bit, and then of course why everyone should adopt a feminist foreign policy. Never been a better time. So we'll chat for about 25 minutes and then switch over to Q&A. So we'll open it up for questions. You can drop questions in the chat function below. If you want to tweet at us also, I'll be checking our Twitter for questions as well. That's at Feminist FP on Twitter. And just like a quick note on housekeeping. So if you can just keep your microphone on mute, that would be fabulous. And we are recording the event tonight, just to flag that with you all so that we can put it up on our social media at the end and have people join who aren't necessarily able to be here in this moment. So before we even get to issues around the pandemic and feminist responses, I first off just want to flag that we are, of course, having a conversation about feminist foreign policy with three white women. And we call ourselves an intersectional organization. But of course, our first three employees are all white. So I think this is really important to kind of acknowledge first off. We typically never do events with only white speakers. We always try and bring in women of color, and that will continue to be the case on the other side of this. But I think particularly given the state of things right now, I think there's a lot of value in bringing the three of us together to kind of discuss our work with CFFP and how we're trying to really shape the FFP agenda as well as feminist responses to the pandemic. So I thought first it might be prudent to kick off this conversation. I'm going to throw it over to Kristina now and just ask you about how you see us incorporating intersectional principles into our work and how we as an organization build more self-reflective practices into our roles.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for asking this question. No, this is so fun. Like, I've never been interviewed, asked a question like this by my co-founder. I love this. So yeah, thank you for pointing out what you just pointed out, because that is so important, obviously. And we have rightly so received comments saying, hey, why is this an event only with white women? And I'm glad that the people we interact with, like our community, is that critical. Especially of our work as well, because improvement and development within work, every work that one does, especially in activist work, can only happen if there's kind of this kind-hearted and sense of criticism. This is how work develops. I guess just to chime in on that briefly, in an ideal world, of course, right from the start, you would have like a group, a very diverse. And that is not only regarding like where people are from, but like there are other factors like class, religion, body abilities, and so forth. You have ideally you have like a very diverse group of people that start something. In reality, like when you set up an organization, it comes mainly in the beginning with like lots of costs. It means like someone who starts an organization, that is someone who can somehow afford the risk, or at least not earning something in the beginning or for quite some time, and then on top the risk of financial instability. And it must be someone who's willing like to do so, who's willing like to potentially have like a like downward curve in their career progression, because you never know how founding and starting an organization works out. Very often, sometimes it just fails, startups fail. So starting an organization, you need to find people who just like want to do it, and you can't force anyone to do it. You can't force anyone like to invest into something that is so freaking insecure. So I guess that is just an explanation to how it happened that the three of us are now here together, because it's like the three people who are willing to risk and pay and like risk all those costs. But going forward, and Marissa has already mentioned that, we will be hiring people, interns, like starting off this year, and diversity is the key factor that we will be looking at, because we realize, of course, that our lived experiences and needs are very limited, and policy making can only be as good as people behind them are diverse, and advocacy for policy making as well. So yeah, I guess that is partly already a response to your question, Marissa. It is intersectionality is one of our three core values at the organization. That is not to say that we're always perfect in applying them, but that we hold ourselves like to the ambition, I guess, to always have it at the top of our mind, and are very, very receptive to criticism that is focusing on lack of intersectionality potentially, and I guess we're very open with our weak spots and very receptive to criticism.
Nice. Yeah, that's a definitely good way to put it. So switching gears a little bit now to focus on pandemic responses. We just finished up a policy brief that was funded by the German Foreign Ministry, specifically looking at how countries with feminist foreign policy have shifted their work to respond to the pandemic, and then pulling best practices from that, and basically putting together a set of recommendations of, based on this evidence, what we think states should be doing. And it's specifically oriented towards Germany, but can be very applicable to most other states as well. So this is honestly my favorite piece of work that we have ever done. We don't know exactly, there it is. We don't know exactly when we'll be able to publish it, but it'll be like very, very soon. So I want to kick that off, because I feel like kick off the conversation with this, because we've just spent a lot of time kind of compressing our ideas into what was supposed to be like a 5-page policy brief, and actually it's 40. So Nina, you did a lot of writing for this policy brief. So do you want to kind of share why we thought this was a good idea, kind of some of the recommendations that we think are really important, etc.?
Sure. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. I'm very excited. And yeah, as Kristina said, and Marissa, we've never done it. So actually, I don't know why, but it seems to be a lot of fun. So we should definitely do it again in a different, maybe more diverse setting. But yeah, I mean, as Marissa just said, we have, I'm just seeing, is there a link to the paper? Unfortunately, the paper is not published yet, because literally we finished it today. So
an hour ago, send it to the Foreign Ministry.
Yeah, so it's still with the German Federal Foreign Ministry, but we intend to publish this as soon as possible, and then obviously we'll also share the link on social media and also on our website and everything. This also goes, and just a side note, we also just finished a study on how an EU feminist foreign policy should look like, and this is also currently being proofread and edited. So we'll also share this study in a couple of weeks. So, I mean, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen a lot of feminist civil society organizations come forward and highlight why this pandemic is a feminist issue. And by no means were we the only ones. We have seen Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, for example, the International Civil Society Action Network, who work a lot with women peace builders. We've also seen the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security publishing specific recommendations of what the UN Security Council should do. So basically every single feminist organization has said that is a feminist issue. And to say in one sentence why this is the case, it's the pandemic and the crisis is reinforcing every existing inequality and every existing structural discrimination. So be it for those people who obviously work in low-paid jobs or have insecure job situations, for elderly people who are more affected by the crisis and who might be affected also more longer when it comes to the restriction of mobilities, but also women. And I think this has something been highlighted everywhere. We have seen the rate of gender-based violence increase by a lot, in some cases even by 40% or 30%. Kristina, help me, 30%. Okay. But I think even in the UK, some of the killings, the femicides have doubled. So we have seen shockingly numbers when it comes to the health and the security of women. At the same time, when obviously services that support survivors of sexualized and gender-based violence are hard to reach because you cannot leave the house, or you cannot call a hotline because you're living with your abuser, and so on. But we've also seen the inequalities reinforcing in terms of participation. So be it political participation, also economic participation. 70% of those people who work in health care jobs are women. They are much more exposed to catching the risk, but also in general of living with the crisis. And also, as we know, most of the unpaid care work at home is done by women. So we have seen a lot of women restricting the amount that they work, or also quitting their job, which obviously in the long term will impact their participation in the labor market, their ability to sustain themselves, but also simply to advance their careers. But we've also seen that because our governments across the world are so male and so white and so old, that a lot of perspectives have been missing in the crisis, in the responses to the crisis. And that obviously leads to a perpetuation of this discrimination of who's actually making the decision and for whom. And obviously, if you have a very small elite circle making decisions, it will also mainly be the male circle that benefits. And we have seen this specifically in Germany, where we have seen the car shops or the car houses, I'm not sure of the English term, but
car industry?
In general, the car industry, I mean, you talk about supporting them, but also the houses where you can shop the cars have been opened before we have opened kindergartens, or before we have developed a system where we can open the schools. So this is a very sad example of who's making the decision for whom. And then just one more point, across the world, we have obviously seen that the reproductive rights and reproductive health services have also been limited for women, because they're being declared as non-essential, because the medical system is overwhelmed, so you have to pool resources. But also we have governments seen, and the US obviously is a very sad example for this, who use this pandemic to promote their political agenda of restricting the rights of women to make their own choices. So maybe I just leave it here. I mean, there are so many different layers of why this crisis is a feminist issue, but there was one part in the policy brief that we looked at. And then, as Marissa said, we also looked at specifically the recommendations, and also how those countries who have a feminist foreign policy, in particular Sweden and Mexico, but also Canada and France, have responded to it. But I will pass over to Kristina, because she has been leading on this piece, to say a bit more about our findings.
Thank you. And I can add more in a second, but maybe I'm curious now, Marissa, why you said it's your favorite piece of work we've done so far. Maybe you want to comment a little bit on why that's the case. And by the way, what I showed before, like the study, the design, that's all done by Marissa. Like everything that looks pretty about our work, that is Marissa. So Marissa, why is it your favorite piece so far?
Thanks. I feel like we're kind of having a conversation about this earlier today. I think there's still a bit of gap in knowledge about how feminist foreign policies are having a very tangible effect. There aren't many you know, publications at the moment by states that kind of outline the actual direct physical impact of their feminist foreign policies. Sweden has published like 1 or 2, and that's about it. So for me, this was a really like just wonderful exercise to really just be able to list out like, this is the way governments have changed their response, this is who they're funding, this is where they're putting their energy to, and this is sort of the expected impact. So it was just a very tangible, almost like you could directly see the train of feminist thought in this particular work, and it was just exemplified very clearly, where I think there's a little bit of muddiness around that still at the moment. And then just in general to, we're still a fairly young organization, and to kind of, you know, have governments welcome us with open arms and want to hear what we have to say and take our recommendations seriously is incredible, and I think really speaks to the legitimacy and authority that feminist foreign policy has as an idea, and just globally, even, you know, like Germany doesn't have a feminist foreign policy, but they're still interested in learning about it and exploring what it could look like. So I just see this like incredible appetite for it, and I feel it just made me feel really optimistic that despite all the terrible things and terrible policies we see, there's still sort of this like shining, glimmering light at the end of the tunnel that like we are slowly seeing progress. So yeah.
No, I agree. And what I also liked about it, because I mean, there is quite some literature out there on why this current pandemic is a feminist issue. Nina mentioned a couple of them before. There's also this amazing website that is called feministcovidresponse.com. So there's a lot out there, but like, I guess, I think as an outsider, and that was at least my experience before we gained more access and insights somehow, you always think like, but why are policymakers not making better policies? Like, why are they not doing this? And why is like this missing? And but of course, sometimes like there's ignorance, and some people just are opposed to including certain ideas, but very often it's just like a lack of knowledge, like lack of ideas and lack of time. So when a foreign office says to you, listen, I'm going to give you a chunk of money, you produce this knowledge for us so that we have an idea what we can do, that to me is something very positive, because what civil society, feminist civil society, including ourselves, what like historically has been more the case is that policy briefs and ideas are produced and you're hoping that somehow people in governments look at them, but then getting asked to provide something and being paid by the work, it should always be the case that civil society and feminist civil society gets paid, right? But it not always is. That is something I find very, very positive. And with this whole feminist foreign policy agenda, like on a government level, it's fairly new. It's not new in like the debates from civil society and academia. Like it's 100 years ago that women came together during the First World War at the International Congress for Women in The Hague, demanding an end to the First World War and like articulating concrete resolutions and suggestions for how to avoid another world war and so forth. So feminist thinking in international affairs has like a long history, but unfortunately not as much where it can have like an influence. And I'm hoping like with this push with like those governments that Nina, Marissa just mentioned that have a feminist foreign policy, and with more and more civil society demanding exactly this, and on top producing knowledge and producing concrete recommendations applicable to like concrete departments within the Foreign Office, and like what they should do in the Security Council, what they should do during the EU Council presidency, like very concrete examples. They could ideally just take them, because they are also lacking time. They don't have time to sit down and think about these things. So yeah, we're hoping that this will make a difference, I guess.
Yeah. And maybe just to add on this, so we did try to include very concrete recommendations, for example, that the government could do now. For example, re-evaluate the Germany's humanitarian response and see if the aid really reaches everyone, also from an intersectional perspective. Does it reach those who are based in, who are forced to live in refugee camps or internally displaced people, and so on and so forth? But we also have very long-term recommendations, such as stop exporting arms, small arms, but light weapons, but also ammunition. But in general, have foster a demilitarization of security structures. And that is, I think, also very characteristic for our work, that we always try to be, on the one hand, be pragmatic and try to give policymakers really concrete action points, but on the other hand, we are advocating for a feminist foreign policy, which is it's a marathon, as we say, and it will take years and decades to get there. But we also need to point out what it would mean if we would actually install it, also to prevent governments of just declaring that they're doing a feminist foreign policy without actually changing anything. So we always have these two sides, and this was also in the policy brief.
Absolutely.
Marissa, you're the boss
Yes.
here. Marissa, shall we chat a little bit more or allow questions already? What says the boss?
I would say let's do one more round between the three of us, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, because I really want to hear what you both think, or what you both want to see on the other side of this pandemic. So we talk a lot about structural change, and I think have really been seeing the ills of a world built on very capitalist values right now. As an American particularly, I think just the kind of disaster that is the US healthcare system is just continually just astounds me that we haven't figured this out yet. But it's because we prioritize profit over people. So there is an opportunity, I think, at least with my Twitter social media bubble, I think I have seen people notice these structural inequalities more so now than ever before, because I think the pandemic has just thrown everything into a really harsh spotlight. So I hope that people now have a bit more knowledge and vocabulary to kind of be discussing these structural changes, so that when we do get to the other side, we can actually, we won't go back to normal. We'll find a new normal that's better. But I'm curious about what you two would want to see on the other side of this. What does that structural change look like for you?
So we have time for a whole PhD now.
Just give it a couple minutes each, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
I'll only do 1 minute.
Condense your PhD into 1 minute.
Easy. Yeah, I'll just do 1 minute. Yes, as you're saying, this is the time for utopian thinking, and really question the very foundations and ideas and paradigms that our society, foreign policy, but also domestic policy, that they have been built on, and that for decades and centuries have been excluding pretty much everyone except well-off men in each country. And that is what feminist analysis in general is about. It looks at power. Feminist analysis is looking at power, who has access to resources, and it tries to change how power is distributed in society. So for the world after Corona, I just wish that we as a society, within foreign policy, within domestic policy, prioritize human security. It is one of the core tenets of feminist foreign policy, right? Feminist foreign policy demands that we're focusing on human security, human rights, access to housing, education, healthcare, instead of military might. That is feminist foreign policy. So, but you can apply it to everywhere in society. So I want our societies to focus on what keeps people secure in this world and gives them the opportunity to equally access power and resources.
Nina?
Yeah, I mean, I can just build really quickly on Kristina's response, because the human security is so essential. And I mean, I think Reaching Critical Will, so the disarmament department of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, has, for example, pointed out that the US had at the moment more nuclear warheads than hospitals. And I think that is a very concrete example of how we prioritize the state security over human security. And just a sentence on human security, I wish we would focus more on the climate emergency, because I mean, we have, obviously it should be treated like a pandemic. It is not treated at all. So I wish that one of these, from the consequences of the pandemic, would be to focus on the climate crisis, but also that we just standardize all policy decisions on a gender and intersectional analysis. I mean, a lot of the work that the feminist civil society has been doing at the moment to highlight why this is a feminist issue and how the pandemic affects politically marginalized actors would not be needed if actually policy makers would do their job and actually base their decisions on gender and intersectional analysis. And maybe just a last point, I feel specifically in Germany, we have a lot of demonstrations against the government's decision to restrict movement and restrict your private life in order to get to save the health system in order to, so that it's responding to the crisis. But we also see it is shifting to providing easy answers, because I feel the government wants to show that they're in control and they want to provide easy answers to those people who are questioning their authorities. And I can understand this on the one hand, but I think it's very dangerous. I think specifically in a pandemic, we need to be able to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers and that we need to trust the science, and that science can also evolve, particularly if there's a new virus. So I really hope that it will also change the way that how we do policies, and that we are more inclusive, that we allow more debate, that we foster more debate, that governments can also acknowledge that they don't have all the answers without being, fearing that we have a lot of populist actors who take advantage of such a saying. So I really hope that we also change the way that policy is made.
Marissa?
Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, me? Oh gosh. So in the UK, I really hope that we kind of roll back a lot of the austerity measures, because I feel like that really hits the most vulnerable people in society. And I think under the Tory government, we've really seen a lot of just terrible austerity policies that particularly hit women and single mothers really hard. And I think in general, having a very kind of militarized approach to national security and not looking at it more holistically, this of course is the kind of human security side of things, is really important as well. And then in the US, my home country, I think, oh God, just so many things. Our healthcare system is just broken. It is broken, and we need a much more socialized approach to taking care of our citizens and making sure that everyone can access healthcare. Like, I was reading articles from people with disabilities when the pandemic started saying, like, I know if I get it, I'm gonna die because the healthcare system here isn't gonna take care of me, which is just like the fact that someone even could think that is just the most horrifying thing. So I think for me, it would be very healthcare oriented. How do we make that system work for everybody? Yeah.
Marissa, can I ask you something? I'm really curious. So do you think, like, you as someone, like, you've left the US, you live in a different country now, but like in general, like the majority of people stay in the countries where they're born if they're not forced away because of conflicts, etc. So if you, maybe many of your friends, or had you never left the US, had you realized how broken the healthcare system is? Or do you grow up and are you being socialized away thinking it's normal that with healthcare they're trying to make profits and not providing for everyone? Like, did you only realize once you left the US? Because us, like, looking at the US, or my friends, we're constantly, how is this even possible in such a rich country? How is this possible? Like, how can this be legal? Seriously?
Yeah, I think, yes. It is very normalized. And I remember when Obamacare went through and I could get access to free birth control, and I was just like, wow, we've done it. Like, free birth control, guys, like, oh my God. And, you know, kind of, I mean, it was a lot better under Obama, but I will bore you all to death if I try and talk about the loopholes you have to jump through to get insurance. it's just unbelievable. And the chunk of money it takes away from you every single month, like, oh my God, it's horrible. And just, you know, the decisions you have to make. I remember when I first moved here, my ex-partner had like some weird like chest pain or something, and so he went to the doctors, and the doctors immediately called an ambulance because they, you know, they just don't
in the UK.
mess around with, in the UK they don't mess around with chest pain. And he called me from the ambulance, and my first reaction was not, oh no, are you okay? I literally, he told me he was in the ambulance, and I said, get the fuck out of that ambulance, we can't afford that. And then I was like, oh no, I live in the UK. They take care of their people here. So yeah, there's been a very eye-opening experience. I've been in the UK for 5 years now. And the longer I'm here, the less I want to ever go back to the US. And healthcare is a big part of that reason, because I can't even describe the peace of mind knowing that if something happened to me, I would be cared for. Versus like, even when I go back for holiday, I make sure I take out like crazy travel insurance just if something happens. Like, oof, yeah, it's messed up. On that positive note, should we switch over to the Q&A now? If you all have any questions, please type them in the chat box. That's actually probably easiest. I've got Twitter up as well.
Or can they also use the raise the hands? And if someone actually wants to say something, then we would hear people's voice. Wouldn't that be nice too?
Yes, I don't know how to do that, so you're gonna have to
like
help me
raise
with that.
I don't. So there's this raise hands button, right? And then people raise hands, and then it shows up, I think. Okay, Mom, Marissa's mom, can you try that, please, for us? Okay, can you click on the raise hand?
There, I unmuted.
Oh.
I can either raise my hand, or I can do.
You can also click on the raise hands button.
There's like a button
Yes.
called raise your hand.
Amazing.
Oh, okay.
Cool. And when we see that, we'll call your name, and then.
So I do have a question.
Oh.
Thank you, Simone, for typing that mini tutorial right now. While you're here, yes, Lisa, proceed.
So my question is, what would be a feminist foreign policy approach to the expectation that are put on the primary caregiver, which is more often than not the woman, in a family structure in the event of COVID, when all of a sudden the children are needing to be homeschooled by Zoom like we are here, and they need to be in school all day long. And how does a woman particularly, or the partner in charge, balance the immediate expectation of healthcare, schooling your children, making sure they're doing what they need to do, and doing their job full time? I have talked to many women here in the United States who are absolutely going out of their minds, overwhelmed. They don't feel they have a support structure during this time, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, you can do it. And they're not given adequate resources to do it in a way that helps them feel healthy and sane.
Shall I try?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think same problems here in Germany, like parents, especially moms, because like the huge chunk of care work is still being done by women in this society. They're suffering. They need to work, and they have to take care of the children. But I think it's even worse in the US, because again, there's this whole social security system lacking, right? You're barely being paid sick leave in the UK. In the US. The US is the only industrial country where there's no maternity pay, for example. Like the social security system is barely existent in the US. So the problems there are so much worse than in some countries in Europe, like Germany, but still the situation is really bad. And I think in a feminist utopia, first of all, care work would not be disproportionately be shouldered by women, but we socialize men and women in a way that both of them think they should be taking care of their children and like cooking their meals and washing their stuff. And then on top, we would change legislation in a way that we do not have tax systems that we have in Germany. It's called Ehegattensplitting, that favors the male breadwinner system. So they're like all these small Stellschrauben, like all those small screws, I don't know, things that you have to change to build a system in society where all genders are being paid equally. There's no expectation that one gender should do more care work. And when a crisis happens, we have a system in place that, what Nina said before, doesn't prioritize the car industry over taking care of children, but pays money and money to like parents instead of those who are buying cars, because they have to take care of children at home, something like that, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, early on in the pandemic, you would have commissioned research of what the pandemic means for children. Like, are they at risk? Are they posing a risk? I mean, we have seen this debate very late in Germany. We've only seen in the last couple of weeks that people realize that probably kids are not even, I mean, I'm not sure about the medical point of view, but that kids are not, most likely are not spreading it as much as we thought. And we would have invested a lot of resources of developing strategies of how you can open up kindergartens and how you can open up schools, even not full time, but even part time. That would have been a big difference. And the government would have advocated for women or partners in general just being able to take more vacation when they need to homeschool kids. And I mean, I think you partly answered your question yourself by saying they're lacking the support system and the resources. And I think a feminist government would just provide them in the first place. And Marissa, there's a question.
We have 3 raised hands. We have 3 raised hands and a question.
Yes, so I think I've got 3. So I'll take all 3 right back to back, and then we can answer it kind of grouped together. So it's Shama and Katharina and Abigail. So do you want to go in that order? Shama, your question first.
We also have 2 questions on the chat, Marissa.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we do the 3 raised hands answer and then the questions in the chat answer, and then that will probably be time.
Hi, yes, this is Shama. I'm from the Philippines.
You messaged me before today.
Sorry?
You messaged me earlier today. Hello.
Yes, I did. Hi, nice to see you. It's evening here, so that's why like my lights are off, because everybody at home is also asleep. But I guess everyone kind of already knows that in the Philippines, like there is there's apparent and definite like state violence that is happening, and not to mention like the spat. Well, spat is an understatement with the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea situation, which kind of gives a sort of justification to the militarization and and more investments to militarization and modernization of the military within the government. And I think that that's the reason why I'm very interested in how Mexico is doing it, because as the only global South country that has feminist foreign policy, it's like something that we look forward to and we look up to as well. But you can probably take note of that, but like I think my main question here is specifically on economic stimulus and how what would be like a feminist analysis to the economic stimulus, like the COVID relief that's happening in the U.S. and the possibility of a universal basic income. I go back and forth on the universal basic income, because on the other hand, a lot of us younger people would be like, oh my God, that is so amazing. But also at the same time, like techpreneurs support it because they know that if you give money to people without them being quote unquote productive, that would mean that they would still be active consumers, which would, propel their businesses, like, Jeff Bezos becoming a trillionaire during a pandemic, which is so unfair. So I think that that's kind of like my back and forth in terms of like the like an economic analysis on COVID and what's a feminist way of moving forward with it as well.
Easy one.
Awesome. And then Katharina.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for this webinar, and thank you for all the work you're doing. 2 questions. One is kind of conceptual, which is basically, you say feminist foreign policy. And in my circles, I often hear the word gender more, like a gendered approach to COVID-19. So for you, what's the difference between saying feminist foreign policy or gender in foreign policy or something? And why did you choose feminist foreign policy? Second question is basically, so foreign policy and diplomacy are male dominated largely. So it's I would be interested in kind of hearing your approaches in dealing with that, like your experiences in dealing with the boys club. Maybe you have certain strategies, because I assume that with the work you're doing, you receive some pushback, you receive critical questions. For example, when you say we need a human security approach, the male, older, white boys club might easily say, yes, but if you don't have the country secure, how can you even think about food and stuff? So we have to look at things how they are, and we have to look at the harsh realities and not some lofty goals. So I'm interested in if you found in your work some approaches, some tips, how you handle these kind of things. Thanks.
Thank you. And then Abigail?
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm originally from Argentina, but I live in Cologne in Germany. And thank you, Shama, also for your question, because I really, really liked it. I also look a lot around the goal, like being from the global south. There is something that it's interesting also and very, very exciting about Mexico. But my question is, because I have the feeling we always in Germany, I lived since 3 years, so I just have a feeling in Germany we are always criticizing the US for how bad the system works and how little social security there is. But I have the feeling in Germany it's very unlikely that you would have a feminist foreign policy, because there is not in the agenda. It's really outside of people's mind. So how can you even discuss this if there's no social annoyance? I don't know how to say it. Like, people are really not worried about it, because in the States or somewhere else it's so much worse. So I have always the feeling that it's a lot much work to convince people here in Germany, or to talk about how that there's still a lot of work to do, that there's still a lot of things that you need to review, that when you look at statistics, the country is really not doing as good as it should. And in my mind, it's actually the opposite. Like, how can such a rich country still afford to not question these things? And yeah, I basically joined because I also saw you're also based in Germany. So I'm really interested in how to bring this more into discussion.
Yeah, tell us about it. Yeah.
Should we each kind of
Pick whatever.
give a quick 2-minute answer? Do you want to kick us off, Kristina?
Yeah. Okay. So the economic stimulus question, like, that is a huge one. Let me. So there out. First of all, there's like feminist economics analysis out there. Like, there are brilliant people out there who are doing exactly that work, looking at that. It's those people who are demanding like gender budgets, for example, gender budgeting, gender analysis. There are some countries like Canada that have gender budgeting. They enshrined it in law like a few years ago. So whatever expenses they make, they need to analyze how it benefits different groups of society. They base it on gender differently. So that can be one way of rectifying it. In our policy brief that we talked about earlier today, that is one of the recommendations that we included. Like, Germany, bloody hell, needs stuff like gender budgeting and universal basic income. We could have like a whole 3-day workshop on exactly that. I'm by no means an expert. I don't know much. A couple of things that I know is like from this book here. It's called Utopia for Realists. You might know it. There's a whole chapter on universal basic income, which references almost studies that exist till today, scientific studies that show what effect it has. So scientifically, it seems to be proven that it has a positive impact on people and societies. So there's a very strong argument for that. But I'm not an expert. I'm reading stuff, and that is kind of just what I'm sharing. No, by no means an expert, but just referencing sources here. Regarding Germany, yes, like there's so many things not going well in Germany, and that is why this organization exists. That is why we're working with the Foreign Office. That is why I personally have been doing feminist activism for a couple of years now, working on changing law on sexualized violence, working currently doing a campaign with others that's called Stadt Blumen, like we don't want applause and flowers, but we want equality. There's so many things going wrong here in Germany. When it comes to like abortion is still in the criminal court, it's not legal. We have no gender budgeting. We have like the share of power beyond white men is like it in no means okay. So yes, whilst I personally and we as an organization do lots of criticism, but also providing recommendations for different German ministries, because there's like lots left to be done. Yeah, and maybe a quick one on feminism and gender. Why we're using the word feminist. Gender is a category. Gender is a category like how you look at certain policies, but feminist is the approach, if that makes sense. And we're using the word feminism in our title. Many people ask us like why we're doing this. Wouldn't it be easier for us if we didn't use it? But like the work that we're doing, we're standing on the shoulders of giants that have been doing the work that we are continuing for decades. So we as an organization, we would find it incredibly ungrateful if we denied those shoulders that we are standing on, like the rights that we have these days. That is all feminists that have won them for us. So we're just continuing their work. That is the legacy. So that's why we of course use the word, because we are grateful and very proud to be in this line of incredible fighters. Done.
Maybe I can, sorry, Kristina, were you done? Maybe I can just build on the question between feminist and gender. Only one more thing, what Kristina said, in addition to feminist being really the vision and the approach of how we want power structures to change, is obviously the intersectionality, which is not specifically implied in gendered, I think. So this is also a big difference for us. On the economic question, just a couple of points in addition to what Kristina said. In our policy brief, one of the recommendations is, for example, debt relief for developing countries. But it's also, as we call it, move the money. So move the money from the defense industry to the human security industry. And I think that not only applies nationally, but also internationally. And I'm trying to tie my answer to one of the questions in the chat. Obviously, a feminist foreign policy doesn't go together with our neoliberal understanding of our economy. And again, we could have whole PhD thesis on this, but I think the very obvious one is that we're using our environment for free, but also that our economic system is based on free care work, but it's also a very unequal international trading system. So it doesn't go together. So that is also why we're criticizing the capitalist system so much. On Germany's position, you're absolutely right. And I think that's also one of the responses we get a lot when we talk with Germans. They're saying like, but actually, how does, for example, Saudi Arabia respond to it? So there's always this tendency to refer to other countries instead of looking at ourselves. And I think we are trying to do this, as Kristina said, and we're also pointing, every time we can point out the shortcomings of Germany. For example, we've criticized Germany a lot for prioritizing the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the UN Security Council and trying to be a vocal advocate for reproductive rights, whereas in Germany abortion is still illegal. So we're trying to point it out as much as we can. And just two more sentences on the Boys Club. I think it is very difficult. I mean, it is difficult. We do get pushbacks. But I think that's part of our work on the one hand, and on the other hand, one of the strategies that at least work for me, and I also know that they have worked for Kristina and Marissa in the past, is building networks with other feminist actors and really feeling the solidarity And I think this is also what is impacting me at the moment with the pandemic so much, is that I get so much energy from meeting with other feminist civil society organizations and see all this energy and this anger also towards and the commitment towards change, and that helps to get over every boys club comment that is out there. So Marissa, do you want to take the questions on the UK maybe? I feel you're best.
I also want to plug really quickly the economic angle. Next week, I'm doing an Instagram live with the executive director of Hawaii's Commission on the Status of Women, and they just published a Hawaiian feminist economic recovery plan that is very focused on structural inequalities. And obviously, Hawaii has a really intense colonial history and a really strong indigenous rights movement. So it really gets into these kind of structural problems and the struggle with like this very neoliberal capitalist way of doing foreign policy and politics. So I highly recommend that and tuning in for that conversation with Cara, because she's like the coolest ever. Regarding can the UK have a feminist foreign policy, I think yes. I'm going to be optimistic and say yes. I don't think it will probably happen under a Tory government. They are surprisingly super on board with the women, peace, and security agenda and gender equality, but it's the F word that freaks them out a little bit still. I do think if we got a Labour government, we would see a feminist foreign policy, which is really cool. So we're kind of in cahoots with, well, you know, we're not party political, but have definitely been like supporting Labour in kind of their interest in this area. And I think particularly, like, again, with that neoliberal point, I think making sure that particularly for the UK, a feminist foreign policy is very cognizant of colonial legacies and imperialist tendencies, which I feel like is the entire basis of our foreign policy, and causes a lot of violence and damage to this day, both abroad and at home. I think that needs to really be at the root of what a UK feminist foreign policy is. So I think yes, I think there may still be a little bit of work in getting a bunch of parliamentarians on board with that. I know some of them are talking about this, but I know for some it's still kind of like a scary idea, I suppose. So there is work to be done, but I do feel incredibly optimistic about it. Let me see. Last questions here. The document, is that the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, I think. That one, if you just literally Google that, that's the name of the actual document, and it'll pop right up. Just trying to scan now because we're just in our last.
Can I say something on abortion?
Yeah.
The comment by Iris, which is important. Thank you, Iris. So abortion in Germany is not legal. It is in the criminal court, and it says blah blah blah, abortion not legal. But under certain circumstances, it is allowed to have an abortion within the first 12 weeks. So there are exceptions to the illegality, but per se, the narrative behind, the thinking behind is that it is not legal in Germany. And there was this really good question about if we have any ideas regarding what to study if you want to get into feminist foreign policy.
Yes.
I would recommend studying something public policy, international politics, diplomacy, whatever in that area. Maybe, if possible, do some gender studies on the side as well, and definitely lots of feminist reading all the time. But as the main course, I think, but you ladies, you tell me what you think, have like a more general course, because then you learn about all the things that you then later want to criticize with the tool of feminist analysis you learn on the side as well.
Yeah, my degree route was bachelor's in politics, master's in gender studies, PhD in politics. So kind of bounce back and forth. but obviously with my PhD, it's very like through a feminist lens. I just happen to be in the politics department. So you can kind of mix and match to suit what you want.
I just would make sure that wherever you're studying, it actually has a feminist lens, because I studied at King's. I studied actually conflict studies, and we never talked about gender inequality being a main driver of violence and conflict. So in hindsight, I would like to have studied somewhere else. And just on the question, if we have a reading list, we have a reading list.
Just pulling it up.
Okay. We have a reading list on feminist foreign policy.
We have we have a whole reading
list. Fairly academic reading list, just to flag, and I've got something in the works to do a more activist focused one. Sorry.
And Marissa has also, and I mean, Marissa is also doing our website, so this is why I'm saying Marissa has done it. We have compiled the resources also on why the pandemic is a feminist issue, and there we also have a lot of further readings, which Kristina also just...
Can I pull it up as well, Nina darling?
Yeah.
Of course.
So yeah, this reading list is just articles about feminist foreign policy specifically, and then the pandemic page, feminist resources on the pandemic, obviously, is about COVID. Both are excellent.
Both are excellent. Wait, where is it? Here it is.
Okay, so I think unfortunately we have to wrap up. I know all three of us would be more than happy to keep chatting with you, so you can find us on Twitter. I'll send a follow-up email to everybody with just info. I can drop some of these links in there as well, so you don't have to worry about jotting it all down now. But I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and especially thank you to those who gave a donation. It means the world to us. Obviously, times are uncertain right now, and we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, but financial stability is a bit of a thing that makes us nervous. So I'm very, very grateful. And if you love our work and want to keep supporting us, the best way to do so is to become a member of CFFP. You can pay a monthly subscription. It starts at £3 a month. We also have a really cool Facebook group called the Feminist Foreign Policy Network, where just anybody who's interested in feminist foreign policy can join and kind of chat about these things in more detail if you wish to. And yeah, I also just want to plug next week's Instagram live chat with Kara from Hawaii, and we'll be going into a lot more detail about a feminist economic plan in response to COVID. Any last thoughts, Nina, Kristina?
We're everywhere on social media. Find us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. We're here.
Drop us a message and an email if there's anything in particular you need from us, or you have an idea that you want to share with us. Do reach out.
Cool.
All right. And on the dot, 8:01. I guess that's not on the dot. It's a minute over the dot. But
yeah, that's not on the dot.
Thank you all so much for joining. This has literally been the highlight of my week. Oh man, it was wonderful.
That was really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a wonderful evening. Oh.